framework that is needed to permit forests to be managed productively and for climate change in each member state, and also at the same time maybe to show that it's not stuck in the past. I hope to have convinced you, or at least with the three of us, that will convince you that we are looking very much to the future, and that it fits in, I think, very nicely with some of the ideas in the last presentation as well. I thought that was very interesting to see this modeling, in particular for substitution. I'll come back to that in one of the slides. So the first thing is that the regulation was adopted on 30th of May. It went through, you know, about actually which button to get there, but I'm going forward. Yeah, that. This link here, because there are language little tunings done by lawyers, and occasionally an indent is changed and a paragraph number is changed. So be sure to download the official version. Don't use one that has been trailing around that you happen to get in a PDF sometime in January. It might not be the right numbering. So I really urge you to do that. Now, you can't see this, I think, but I will read it out anyway. I think it's important to note that it was indeed a difficult book. Katrina, who was here but I think has gone, took part in that discussion very intensively with us. But at the end, it was a very strong vote from the Parliament, 574 in favour, 79 against, with 32 abstentions. And that, if you look at the three pieces of legislation related to the climate that went through in that period, the LULUCF one actually had a very, very strong support of the Parliament. I think I'm very correct in saying stronger than the other two pieces of legislation. Also in the Council, 26 member states in favour, 1 against. I'm going to say it, Poland, it's on the record, everybody can see, and 1 abstention, Latvia. And the abstention from Latvia was not relating to forest, it was relating to the proposal, in fact the insistence by the Parliament of including wetlands in the accounting scheme. So yes, a lot of discussion, a lot of technicality, a lot of ideas that had to be discussed, but nevertheless at the end I think a very good common understanding of what the legislation was about. So I've got a couple of slides on what the logic of the proposal is and the importance of different things. The first is that we try to move progressively. We're not moving straight into something completely new. We try to take ideas that are accepted internationally and make them fit to the EU and make them fit essentially also to member states. So for example, the FRL concept is a concept in itself that allows each member state to have a different way of managing its accounting for forests. And that's important. We could have just put in something like a net-net accounting system like the US has, not that the US really is relevant in this context, but we could have simplified it, but we didn't. We kept it complicated to make it possible for member states to have differentiated ways of doing it. We also streamlined it. We built it on the greenhouse gas inventories. I'll talk a bit about that later on. We focus on the managed land, so we focus on how the interaction with, for example, forest management takes place, and build on the objectives, like was mentioned by Katrina, in fact, earlier, the importance of the Paris Agreement, what is stated in there, the multiple objectives, the consideration of food, fibre, feed, and how we can get to balanced emissions in the second half of the century. So that's the kind of frame that we were working in. So what we ended up with for the entire climate package, I guess some of you might have seen this before, but it's worth reminding ourselves, is the international target of at least minus 40 reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990. Why 1990? Because that's the sort of international gold standard. How much have we reduced since 1990? However, internally, we set a set of policy objectives and accounting frameworks, essentially, whether it's with the emission trading system here, where there is a 43% reduction against 2005, so you could say this sector has to work harder. The fact that it's against 2005 is because we've got good quality data. And on the other side, the non-ETS, a little bit less of a pressure, if you like, because it's only minus 30, but when you add the two together, you get this minus 40. Again against 2005, and put into two different policy frames, if you like, two pillars. The effort sharing regulation, which basically drives the target, each member state getting a different target, and then again another important thing, I haven't got that slide, but a differentiation. Each member state has a different target to get, with some little variation on flexibilities, and an interaction with LULUCF where we count as no debit. So we say that the member state has an objective to get to a balanced accounting level, and that the plus and the minus is what is added to their individual target to achieve the overall non-ETS target. Now these are the pluses and the minuses that can be applied inside the framework. This one, 280 million tonnes, was discussed a lot, but I don't think it's particularly, it does come into play with forestry, but it's not the key thing for forestry. This is the one that's for forestry. Because if there is a use of a resource, and I take a simple case like we were just seeing just now, let's decide that there's an interest to mobilize wood to use for substitution that counts in another sector, for example the building sector for materials, then yes, it might mean that against the accounts there is a less, let's say, a slightly negative effect, but in fact it may be compensated by a benefit in the effort sharing regulation, and that is actually a promotion to be able to use wood if a member state decides it wants to go that direction. So the kind of analysis we just saw, I think, are really, really interesting and crucial, so that the member state can decide how it wants to use this policy flexibility, and how to decide, therefore, to establish its interaction with whether to keep carbon in the forest or to actually find ways of improving the biomass that it can use out of the forest. Okay, I know I'm going to have to keep going relatively fast, so I'm going to jump this a little bit. I'm sure that the slides, of course, will be circulated. Take as many photos as you want, but you can have the original, no problem. We cover the entire land area in due course, certainly up by 2030, and we use a standardization, avoiding duplicating data sets, so we streamline a lot of the technical work that administrations, member state administrations, have to do. I think I'll keep going as well. What's important is it's based on a greenhouse gas inventory. This is internationally reviewed, so we have not too many opportunities of how we do things there. There are rules that are laid out and by the IPCC that we're expected to follow, and therefore the calculation of how this happens is taking place on these inventories. And I'm going to give a little overview to explain in the general sense. So we have general categories: forest land, cropland, grassland, wetland settlements, and other land. And we have each year reported what that land is. So this is obviously forest land, the dark green one here. And if it's stable, the land is remaining as it is, then it's on this diagonal. But if it changes to another type of land, and that's very important, about half the emissions in Europe come from change, then we know that they are in a what we call a transition category. So we have this relatively sophisticated reporting done by member states, but it's needed under the UNFCCC. What we then try to do is apply those categories to come up with what we call accounting rules. So we have methodologies behind how to do these calculations. They are also applied, of course, in the forestry part. And very important change is that we start to be more geographically explicit. We start to need to know where things are happening and where the changes are taking place. Now these changes, again, in terms of methodology, at the moment, the default way of doing things is what we will call here an approach 1 using national statistics, IPCC default values. The regulation does ask member states, or I should say require member states in most cases, to be more detailed and have a more specific, even country-specific values, for example, or better modeling to come up with their estimates. So there is quite a lot of work for member states to do in the next 2 or 3 years, and we're working very hard with guidance, with interaction with the member state administrations to achieve that improvement. I'm going to go directly to the actual slides to show a little bit how we then take the rules that we have for the different land use types. So we break up the accounting, so we know that what is what land is deforested, what is afforested, what is managed forest land, what's managed cropland, managed grassland, managed wetland. And we apply a set of rules, and these rules are in the articles in the regulation, basically from Article 5 to Article 10, that explain how we will do the calculation. So, a standardized framework, but each member state does it in accordance with the methodologies that they have been establishing over time. Wetlands only mandatory from 2026, by the way. The colors here are not coincidence. They are helping you show for which part of the land uses which rules apply, and basically the land is cut up into different zones, which are then computed, if you like, to see what the difference will be, in most cases with a reference around 2005. So in the case of forest land, it's a little bit the same, but it's not quite the frozen in the past, I think. In fact, we have to project forward, but this will be much more on Giacomo's presentation that will come to explain that. So for example, these categories are related to a forested land. It's where cropland, grassland, wetland settlements or other land becomes a forest. For 20 years, it goes into this category, and the absorption is added into the accounts overall for the member state. Not to forget the carbon pools, and again, unfortunately this is on the bottom, so you won't be able to see it maybe, but I just want to point out that under managed forest land, and again this is the international convention of what we're supposed to be doing, we have to understand what is the above ground biomass, so the trees effectively, below ground biomass, litter, dead wood, soil organic carbon, and the famous harvested wood products, so the use of the wood that goes into another pool and is kept without being released immediately. I know a lot of discussion was taking place about the caps and what wasn't capped and what is capped. So harvested wood products and dead wood in the end are not capped if there would be a credit calculated for a member state. And that was important, obviously, for I think all, not just in the Parliament, but also member states. But the dead wood one looks rather complicated, but it's not that complicated at the end of the day. It's because from an environmental perspective, there's an interest to preserve as much dead wood as possible in the forest. And that's a kind of incentive that can be identified. Now this is just an example to show the reference level that then Giacomo will talk about in much more detail. But we're currently in the phase of modelling forward the objective reference period based on, indeed, we have to start somewhere to do that model, but whereas, for example, in the other sectors, I take, I don't know, emissions from transport, there's a reference that is stuck in the past. We take a reference in the past and fix it and then apply that to our reduction in the future. With forest, we look at the ups and downs that you saw in some of the slides earlier of where forest will be. So we take, Giacomo will go through in more detail, but we take the historical information, in particular 2000-2009, and then try to work out where this is going to be going in the future, and that becomes the reference. Not, for example, here, that would be the continuation of the past value averaged into the future. In this particular case, anonymous, it's actually depending on the framing you use, it would be a slightly weaker sink. So that is because there is an aging of the stands and there is an expectation that more harvest would be taking place. So that then would not penalise this country if there was an increase in the harvesting in this particular example. Okay, Article 8 refers, there was a lot of discussion on these different years, this kind of graph was used in the Council, but in the end the reference was 2000-2009, agreed between the co-legislators. Not to forget Article 13, and Article 13 is very important because the FRL is very technical, and it's meant to be very objective, it's meant to be transparent. And Article 13, which is also transparent of course, but it's not such a technical one, it's a much more a political article. And what we know is that there is a risk that a member state may end up with debits against the reference level. And that needed to be resolved politically. So Article 13 addresses the case where there's a policy risk of unexpected harvest increase that would trigger a debit. And at the same time, because of the way the article is designed, and I won't go into detail, it assures the integrity of the overall EU 28 number. So this article can only be triggered if the EU 28 is as a whole no debit. So because of that, it reinforces the rationale for robust FRLs. I think we remain with a clear reasoning that the FRL is technical and objective, and in the political risk or the policy risk of debits, there are conditions which can be applied in order to produce this compensation numbers, which are in Annex 7 of the regulation, so it's Article 13 and Annex 7. Obviously, that's too big a number, but you can find it on the last page of the regulation, which gives some space for member states to cope with that risk, if you like. So, penultimate slide. Where are we now? So we've gone out of the process of getting the proposal adopted. We are now undergoing Article 8 really work, which is the National Forestry Accounting Plan. We've been working on the guidance, which we're about to talk about in a little while. The guidance was published in July 20th. Member states had a pre-version at the beginning of July that they were able to discuss, and there were a number of workshops. I think several people in the room, Heikki and Florian, were also crucial in organising workshops, and even the member state organised workshops were extremely important to do that. So we're now in a phase where it looks like the Commission has got nothing to do. Unfortunately, we do have quite a lot to do still on other things. But then we will start the receipt of the NFAPs at the end of this year, and we will have a review process that starts next year, which will hopefully be kicked off in October with the announcement of it officially. I'm still waiting for some of my administration to unblock it. But the adoption of the FRLs itself are in 2020, so we have a phase to do the review in that period. I did hear, while I was having a coffee, someone say that, but there were no stakeholders involved in this process up to now. That's because there is a stakeholder process at national level, and we would, of course, we cannot guarantee what that will be. It's according to the national law, but the process of producing the NFAP is required to be undertaken in accordance with the national legislation. So I would suggest that you look nationally to see what is the process and how that plan is being done. We have an obligation to be very transparent once we receive the plans, but until we do, it is in the hands of the member states. Then there's a whole series of work that needs to be done on the inventories. I will not bother you too much about that over the next few years, and of course in 2021 it gets done. So, last slide. This is the summary of the regulation. We have a LULUCF pillar with very strong connections to the effort sharing regulation. The no debit rule is a kind of high-level goal, ensuring that additional action, when a member state does something to increase the way that sink happens, whether it's in forest or on land, agricultural land, that this produces credits to meet the reduction target. But there are connections, I would say, in the back door from the ESR to the LULUCF as well. It works on internationally agreed reporting and accounting rules. The setting of the forest reference level is to provide member states to be able to address their own particular situation, but in an objective and, let's say, scientifically presentable way. There's a governance process, which I didn't go into much, but that has a very clear role for member states. We're not the only people in the room, but it's very clear that the member states are heavily involved in the assessment of other member states' accounting plans. And we want to make sure as well that internationally we're very transparent. So we have a basis completely in the UNFCCC. So, Thanks so much, and I think I hand over pretty quickly to Giacomo, I suppose, yeah? Unless there were any very fast questions.
Any clarifying questions? There was a lot of content in this talk. I'm afraid if I open for clarifying questions, there will be a lot of clarifying questions.
So please, Giacomo.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Giacomo Grassi. Thanks for inviting me to this important event. I work for the Joint Research Center, which is the scientific branch of the European Commission. During this LULUCF legislation, we supported Simon and many other colleagues on a number of issues related mainly to reference level. Well, these are an overview of the outline, and I'll try to go as fast as I can. Most of these information, these slides, are taken from 3 publications. Happy to share. All these slides will be then available. Let's start with the fact that there is a forest mitigation opportunity right there. And to start with, let's have a look to the global carbon budget. We have on the left side the anthropogenic emissions, including about more than 12% land use change. These are globally. And on the right side, we have where this emission goes. Nearly half remains in the atmosphere, creating the global warming problem. And about a third is absorbed by ecosystem, mainly forest. From this slide, it is already clear that land use change and forest management are somehow part of the problem and part of the solution. They are in both sides of the equations. In the following slide, we'll have a look to a subset of this capacity of forest to absorb CO2. Despite this mitigation potential, which is highlighted by science globally, not only on reducing deforestation, but also in increasing the sink, till recently forests have often been seen as a secondary mitigation option by climate forest. At this point in time, some of you already heard from me the story that my daughter once told me, "Daddy, your slides are too boring. Why don't you tell a story instead?" That's it. So, telling, essentially, my point is that forests were treated a little like Cinderella excluded from the ball. Like Cinderella was told, "Good work, you're very good in cleaning the fireplace and removing the ashes." So forest sector was told by the other sectors, "You're very good in cleaning up the air to keep the water clean. But you are LULUCF sector, you are too complex, too uncertain. You are kind of worms. We can't afford you to. We can't afford you to enter in the real mitigation game." In that respect, the Paris Agreement has been a game changer. According to the country's pledges, this is a global level made ahead of Paris Agreement. The forests are expected to provide up to a quarter of the planned global emission reduction in 2030. We're not entering the detail here, but the message that the country themselves at global level sees forests as very important. The message, in other words, apparently Cinderella shined at Paris ball. So science is clear. The Paris Agreement can't be reached without forest-based mitigation, including conserving and enhancing the sink. In other words, we need Cinderella to get married with the prince. we need not only that she goes to the ball, but really realize mitigation. However, something is missing. What is missing between the ball and the marriage? What is missing? My daughter will reply immediately, the glass slipper. So what is our glass slipper? It is what prevents the forest sector mitigation to be trusted by other sectors. And I identify here two elements. First of all, we need more confidence in estimates. There is a huge uncertainty right there. And then we need more transparent and credible accounting of the forest sector. The next slide will focus on this second aspect. How to increase the credibility of forest mitigation through accounting. So, the Paris Agreement and the challenge of the forest sink accounting. The Paris Agreement calls for economy-wide targets. Economy-wide means that are cost-effective, there are no displacement of emission. Economy-wide implies fungibility across sectors. So mitigation should be consistent and comparable across sectors. This means that 1 ton of carbon mitigation in the energy sector should be consistent and comparable with 1 ton of mitigation in the forest sector. is fundamental. The Paris Agreement explicitly calls for forest-based mitigation, including conserving and enhancing sinks. And when accounting the mitigation action toward the country's pledges, the country shall promote environmental integrity and avoid double counting. This means that accounting should reflect genuine deviations from past activities that generated emissions. This is valid for all sectors, including forest. But this is very challenging for the forest sector to demonstrate what is additional, as the future emission can change irrespective from actual management because of age-related dynamics. Which are the options for climate mitigation through forest management? I summarize here in 4 groups, and I congratulate and thank with the previous speaker for the very interesting presentation, and I thank because it saves me some time in explaining these topics. But essentially, we can group the option between increasing carbon stock in the forest, the sink, and in wood products, and substitution effects. Okay, there are some numbers here, but the message is that the increasing of carbon stock is included, a report in accounting LULUCF. The mitigation, the substitution effect are reported in the sector. Here, the main challenge to me is a communication one. We should put a flag with written forest. This is thanks to our management. These are seen in other sectors, in the energy sector, but it's due to a good forest management. Of course, I'm not suggesting to change the way the greenhouse gas emissions are reported, but the way they are communicated between all these options. Each has its temporal dynamics of emission. The best mitigation strategy is not maximizing the sink. Till recently, countries have been obsessed with the sink itself. The best mitigation strategy is the one that optimizes the sum of these options in a given time frame, which is up to policymakers to decide. And the optical mix is very much country-specific. This is very, I think that partly answer to the question we had before. It's very much country-specific. There is no intention by LULUCF regulation to say increase the sink or increase wood, probably increase this or that. It's totally up to the country. It's a policy choice and depends very much on the specific situation of the country. The Kyoto Protocol approach to forest accounting. So to factor out the age-related dynamics, which I've seen, it's one of the specific features of the forest sector, which makes it really different to other sectors. The idea of projected reference level was developed. The reference level essentially is a benchmark. This historical time period, the dashed black line is a projected benchmark against which the future performance will be compared. So if your removal is smaller than the reference level, you may have a debit. If it is greater, you may have a credit. This is the concept, essentially. The credibility of this approach entirely depends on how this benchmark is set. Under Kyoto, 101 countries submitted reference level in 2011, including age-related dynamics, and in many cases also the assumed future implementation of pre-amendment 2009 policies. These are the results. Hope you can see. These are the EU harvest projected in 2011. This is the historical rate with the drop in 2009. And then in 2009, they projected countries, including policy assumptions, they projected a strong increase in harvest that, in fact, did not materialize, not as much so far. This is reflected in the evolution of the sink. So negative numbers is because it's a CO2 absorption, removal from the atmosphere. So you see the sink quite stable here. In 2011, it was predicted a collapse, a quite substantial decrease in the sink because of greater harvest. In the short term, if you increase harvest, the sink decreases. This, again, did not materialize yet. And we have a difference here. So the sink is much greater than was anticipated a few years ago, not 1 century ago, in 2011. This is equivalent to 120 million tons of CO2, which is equivalent to nearly 1.3, 1.4 1990 EU total emissions. The question is, why reality is so different from projections? Impact of new policy, economic crisis underestimated by models, or projections inflated with harvest assumptions? I'm not going to answer to any of these questions. I think that most of answer could be legitimate. The key point is that which are the impact of such an approach on the credibility of reference level? Well, I list a number of very concrete risks. The first risk is the risk of windfall credits, credits for no activity. So I assume a big increase in harvest. This assumption cannot be really reviewed, because how can you review a policy assumption? It would be a policy judgment. And then a deviation from a policy assumptions will give me credits for doing nothing, essentially. It's a risk. Another risk is hiding emissions. I omit policy-driven increase in emissions from the accounts. It is very important to understand that for the atmosphere, reducing the forest sink is equivalent to increasing emissions. Mathematically, it's the same thing. If this reduction, policy-driven, again, so a deliberate choice to harvest more, not because of age structure, but just because I want to harvest more, is fully legitimate, but has an impact on the atmosphere. If this reduction is due to a policy-driven, even sustainable harvest increase, including in the reference level, means that emissions seen by the atmosphere would disappear from the account. No other sectors is allowed to do that. This holds true even if the extra harvest policy are well justifiable for economy adaptation and so on. We are facing some countries we have to harvest more because of bark beetle infestation, for example. They have to harvest more for adaptation reason. Do that. I think from a forestry point of view is what you should do. But claiming that this should be factored out from adaptation means that it's like if a country, because of sea level rise, have to build cement barriers along the sea coast. Say, well, I do it for adaptation, so I discount from the accounts the greenhouse gas emissions associated with cement productions. Who would support that? Lack of cross-sectoral consistency. Higher harvest may reduce the sink in the LULUCF sector, so you may have a debit. But as we have seen nicely in the previous presentation, will lead to extra emission reduction in other sectors, which are fully counted. So if you count the benefit, you should count also the possible debit. The lesson learned is that policy assumption at the reference level may hamper the credibility of comparability of accounting with other sectors, where the atmospheric impact, positive or negative, of any policy after the base year is fully reflected in the accounts. So consistency and comparability with other sectors is one of the main drivers beyond the reference level approach. So principle behind the new reference level approach. So we started from Kyoto, then we said, let's try to improve it and to make it more credible. So the principle is that accounting of forest mitigation should reflect fully the atmospheric impact of changes in forest management practice relative to the reference period. We think that makes it more similar to other sectors. Think what happens in the agricultural sector. The emissions in the base year of the agricultural sector, to simplify, can be described in terms of amount of livestock and amount of fertilizer that you give in this year. If emission changes, it's because you change either the number of livestock or the amount of nitrogen. If you don't change anything, if the management remains constant, the emissions remains also constant. The same applies to the forest sector, with one difference. The forest sector, the sink can go up and down, and the harvest need may go up and down because of age structure dynamics. So we propose to project the reference level assuming the continuation of historical forest management practice, which includes few concepts. The first one is that the historical forest management practice is defined entirely by the country, based on best available documentable, quantifiable, and reviewable information. Anne will explain it more in detail. There is a technical guidance which explains it extensively. Then the continuation of forest management practice is combined with the age-related expected change in forest characteristics like biomass or net impact. If a forest gets older, they say if you now harvest forest at 100 years, but in 10 years' time you have more area of forest which reach 100 years, you will have to harvest more to continue with the same forest management practice. We don't want to penalize country because forests are getting older. The projections does not include any assumed impact that policy market may have on future management practice. And this is the main difference from the Kyoto Protocol. The approach, though, is flexible to accommodate country-specific circumstances, so to reflect fully the age structure dynamics, avoids the potential unfair outcome associated to age structure dynamics, and yet we think that is science-based. Which is the expected impact of that? The expected impact is that harvest volumes are expected to increase by 12% in 2030 at the EU level. These are our simulation that we did at EU level. So essentially you have the historical harvest, here the high harvest assumption included in Kyoto, here are our simulations. This increased harvest is not due to policy assumptions, but is due to a reviewable and data-based information on age-related dynamics. So, because of forests are getting older in most of the EU countries, the need of harvest to continue the same management practice will slightly increase. And the sink as well will slightly decrease. So, it's true that the atmosphere will see a decrease in the sink, but this is not related to policy choice, it's related to age-related dynamics, and we don't want to penalize countries for that. The impact of proposed reference level is also consistent with the EU long-term trends. In this picture, you see the blue lines is the historical harvest in the last 50 years and the historical increment. And you see that the sink of above ground biomass, at least, is essentially the difference between the growth and the harvest. And we had a more or less stable sink in the last 20 years. And our simulation shows that the increment will slightly decrease because of forests getting older. We did not take into account the possible positive impact of climate change, and harvest will essentially increase. So according to our proposal, following the reference level, the percentage of increment that is harvested increase in the reference level. More harvest in the reference level generates benefits in other sectors without having necessarily debit. And important is to understand that extra harvest above the reference level, even if the harvest is a bit greater than that, it does not necessarily lead to LULUCF debits, because it may be compensated by extra increment. There are large opportunities to enhance forest growth. We have seen some of the simulation here. Of course, it takes some time, but there are a lot of possibility. If you increase the increment here, then you can increase harvest without having any debit. The reference level is based on CO2, not on cubic meters of harvest. Some common misunderstanding on the reference level. Some understood the reference level as a maximum harvest contract, like to say a cap. Not at all. The reference level, the EU member states are totally free to manage the forest in a sustainable way as they wish, according to consistently with other policy, of course. The reference level is not a limit that must be met. It's just an accounting baseline. It's not a management plan. It's not a management plan. It's just an accounting baseline with the ensure that forest carbon management is accounted in a way which is comparable with other sectors. Allow Cinderella to go to the ball and marry the prince. Reference level, another misunderstanding, reference level is based only on the historical harvest level. Not at all. Reference level is determined by the interaction between the projection of continuation of historical management and age-related dynamics. So the combination of past management defined by the country and age-related dynamics. Not meeting the reference level could harm the forest image of the country, not at all. Again, reference level is not a sustainability benchmark. It should not be used to assess the quality of forest management in the country. Conclusion. The new approach to set the reference level acknowledges fully the country-specific forest dynamics, does not penalize countries if forests get older, is compatible with an active management. At the same time, we believe that the reference level approach increases the credibility of forest sector accounting, including for the use of bioenergy. You know the controversy, the ideological controversy that arose on reference level. We offer a policy-neutral approach to count fully bioenergy in the greenhouse gas inventories. These are prerequisites for the fungibility with other sectors, and also to increase the credibility and therefore to increase the likelihood of climate-related investment in the forest sector. If you are more credible, if people say, we think that we will not be attacking the credibility of carbon credit in the forest sector, then we think that it will increase climate-related investment. Of course, there are challenges and opportunity linked to that. A challenge is the technical complexity of reference level. All countries in Europe are striving to build a reference level, which is a technical challenge. But this is also an opportunity to look better to their data. Another challenge is to recognize and communicate an holistic and cross-sectoral approach to forest carbon management, which is not, the impact of forest management is not only through the carbon sink, but is also through the substitution effect. So looking holistically, as we heard from the previous presentation, and communicate it. And when you count for debits and credits, count everything, not only the sink, is the way forward. Thank you very much.
That was another very comprehensive, very detailed presentation as well. No clarifying questions, I'm afraid. Because Arno has the floor now. There you go.
Talking about negative, I think I have negative time before the lunch.
No, you have positive time. You have positive time.
Okay.
We're all good.
Okay,
But in order to keep that positive time for you.
Hopefully a positive presentation. Great, so hello everyone from my side as well. So Anu Korasu is my name. I come from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is IASA, located in Vienna. So we're this member-based organization that is international and not related to Austria more than to any other member countries either. So we were coordinating the technical guidance document and preparing a lot of it, led by Nicholas Forshell, who is my colleague, and in collaboration with a number of different experts on the field. The aim of this document is to, first and foremost, to provide advice for countries for estimating and reporting the forest reference levels and national forest accounting plans, including the reference level, in line with the LULUCF regulation, and also to provide good practice or good examples that would be considered as good practice for doing the calculations, for thinking the different aspects in the regulation, and providing a transparent and verifiable approach for actually bridging the gap between the legal text and then the modeling exercises and the assumptions that need to be made when the actual technical modeling starts to take place. So as I briefly mentioned already, there's quite a big team behind the whole thing. So the whole project is led by a consultancy called ICF, and then IASA and ITER are partners in that consortium. As I told, we are experts in forest management, forest modeling, greenhouse gas inventories, harvested wood products, and LULUCF accounting in general. And so this was a contract by DG Klima, and while we were independent experts in doing the guidance document, we were really working together with DG Klima and JRC in discussing the different options and also sort of trying to get the understanding of what is their understanding of the regulation and whether our then professional background, whether those examples would be completely against or more or less in line with the understanding that the Commission has. And well, the work started, as we heard already. The negotiations took place until basically end of last year. Our contract started somewhere in the end of January, and actually about in the beginning of February we actually really started going with the process. So it's been quite a tight spring and summer, I would say. But what made it easier and more interesting, and also gave us maybe more confidence in that it actually we at least know a bit what we're talking about, is the consultative process that was behind it. So we started by sending a survey to all the member states, receiving answers basically from all the countries in their past experiences in the KP reporting, and also their modeling capacities, and then also especially the challenges and the difficulties that they already saw at that point, say in February, beginning of March, in what they were expecting to have for the reference level. So that gave a lot of written input for that. Within the contract, there were 2 official meetings organized by DG Klima to discuss with all the member states. So the first one was in the beginning of April, and then the last one was to actually discuss or present the final document. But as I mentioned, and as has been previously said already, there is a great interest by the member states, which then benefited us really largely. So there were 3 workshops that were organized by the member states, where they invited us to attend and also present. And then also a technical workshop then organized by JRC, where we got the whole day to discuss the forest reference level. And these workshops, well, it followed the the course of time with the preparation of guidance. So starting from actually the member states presenting their expected problems, into then us proposing solutions and then discussing the solutions with the member states. Finally, it was agreed that we even shared the draft document in June with the member states and invited for comments. And those as well, we were really impressed by the really quite substantial but very constructive comments for the actual document that we were still able to include in the final version. And now, of course, I put the link here down here, but I will repeat it once more. So the final version that was then published in 20th of July is available for everybody online. I hope that most of you have already had a chance to look at that and hopefully get a bit better understanding of possible ways and approaches to actually look at the reference level. How the guidance document was set up, we put it into 3 different sections, and then a number of annexes getting into a bit more detailed information of the different sections. So first, this overview of the principles behind the GAG accounting and also LULUCF sector in general, and an overview of the regulation text. What we saw quite early on in the consultations was also that when you start the negotiations went on the political level, and then who actually needs to implement, they're the technical experts who deal with models. And there we felt that it's important to actually bring those 2 clans together as well, understanding what it is about, but then on the other hand, what are the technical aspects that need to be taken into account to actually be in compliance with the actual regulation. So the overview of what it is for and what it basically is about, to actual examples, possible approaches, how to do the modeling, and what kind of assumptions need to be considered, what would be a good way to solve certain problems that they're bound to be, and what might not be considered as in line with the regulation. And then the 3rd section, a bit shorter one, is then going more detailed into the specific criteria that the regulation puts on, or what needs to be taken into account in the regulation, in the FRL, and also an example table of content then for the submission to then hopefully make the review process a bit more easier, and also the submissions more consistent with each other. I will take this slide really quickly. Giacomo already talked a bit about this, and basically what's here, the interesting part. So the countries have already done more or less a similar exercise within the KP. Now politically, this new FRL or the new regulation is more binding. Here with green are basically the parts that are more or less the same, at least in spirit, that were in the KP. Although there are certain wordings that might make a bit of difference, so of course that is important to take into account. What is maybe the biggest one for the reference level itself is this, as was already discussed quite a bit by Giacomo, the exclusion of policies and expectations of future development. Instead, the reference level will be based on the age-related forest characteristics and the past management and the continuation of this, and not take into account what kind of expectations we might have for the future. Some of the key criteria in the actual regulation, of course, we read carefully the whole regulation, and it's a number of different articles. But there are some parts that are really relevant for the actual setting the reference level. And Article 8.5 is one of the key ones. So just to quote that one, the reference level shall be based on the continuation of sustainable forest management practice as documented in the period from 2000 to 2009 with regard to dynamic age-related forest characteristics in national forests. And then, of course, when we started to do the regulation, then the guidance document, we we needed to start to dissect what does every single word mean here, why is it just like this, why is it not something else, and there were quite interesting discussions also during the whole process, also with the member states, on how to interpret this and which parts of these are actually limiting, such as really in the period of 2000 to 2009 is quite clear there. Well, then of course we all know the discussion of what is sustainable forest management and how to be sure that that is taken into account correctly. Also, what it says should be based on best available data and take account of the future impact of the dynamic age-related forest characteristics. Basically, meaning that you need to model the development in the future. And then there is a number of other criteria also in the annexes, of which one of the key ones is that it should be consistent with the greenhouse gas inventories. And transparent, complete, consistent, comparable, and accurate information should be the basis for the reference level. On this basis, we developed and described in the guidance a stepwise approach on how to be compatible and compliant with the regulation, and how to actually document in the submissions that the regulation has been taken into account. Of course, the guidance that we provide, that's our interpretation, and it's not binding for the member states. It, of course, may be that we have missed some other completely different approach, and that's okay to go with that kind of submission as well. But then this is at least something that we can be confident in, that this has been discussed extensively and is one way to go forward and set the reference level that is according to the regulation. So here we have 6 different steps, and then we give a number of different examples for the different steps. And as I said, the assumptions also are discussed quite extensively that include or are included in the steps. Just quickly, I think I don't have too many slides, so you can be confident that you will get lunch at some point as well. But I think it might be interesting and important to go through the steps briefly on how do you actually start. And here all the time we have had the basis on the transparency and the robustness of the actual modeling, how to make sure that others who are not familiar with your country or the forest within your country or the forest management within your country can still see that you have been compliant with the regulation. So we proposed the step 1 and 2, and as you see, there's this two-way arrow. So it might be that you need to adapt a bit here when you start to work. So as a first one, was just to stratify the managed forest land, or classify to similar enough classes that where then the forest management practice can be defined for each of those strata or classes. And of course, if you hear, when you start to define the forest management practice, realize that actually we have also other forests that cannot be treated this way, then you might need to update a bit the stratification to make sure that you have all the managed forest land taken into account. When you're more or less sure what you have in the forest, and also what happened there during 2000 to 2009, so the forest management practice documentation, what is the key of the actual the regulation. Then it's time to select methodology. And given that the reference level needs to be in compliant or consistent with the greenhouse gas inventories, the methodology, when you put the historical data in, we suggest to actually confirm that the methodology can, and it's even said in the regulation that you need to provide proof that the methodology can reproduce the greenhouse gas inventories. So before actually going to estimate any of the forest reference level itself, you need to make sure that you first of all have the data, and then you have a methodology that can be used to provide this kind of information. And if not, then you need to maybe revise go a bit back whether there's some other methods to be used. But hopefully all the countries will eventually come with yes, which then always with modeling you might need to calibrate a bit so that actually the greenhouse gas inventories are consistent also in the future in the projections. Oh, sorry. But when you have done this, then it's time to project the reference period data according to regulation, and then as a final step to calculate the actual forest reference level, which is then the average of the emissions and removals during the compliance period. So 2000 to 2001 until 2025 for the first emission. Then, just as a reminder to everybody, so the schedule is quite tight. As we heard, the actual regulation was just finally approved in the end of spring. So, yeah, the guidance document is out there. We're now waiting eagerly the member states to submit their proposed FRLs by the end of this year for the review. And what happens next is then it will be reviewed, and by the end of next year there's possibility to provide revisions if suggested by the review team, so, which is then member state experts together with commission experts. And then by last of October 2020 it will be adopted, hopefully for each member state. And then there was another project, just really briefly, so this is also something coordinated by ICF to assist. There were some countries who have the methodological, maybe data problems or really challenges to actually put this together. So they have then asked DG Climate to provide bilateral support to identify first the challenges, but they work together with the countries and how to interpret the guidance document and how to be able to actually submit. But within this project, also it's not the actual calculations, which are the responsibility of the member states, or they need to solve it how they choose. But here it's identified also support from the Commission then on inventories or modeling need improvements. And this was my last slide, so thank you very much. Here, just quickly, the guidance document found here, the regulation itself here, and if you cannot remember, you can Google Klima's homepages and then navigate there a bit, and you will eventually find them. I tried, it's possible.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are 15 minutes into our lunchtime, and this is the most important time of day. Of course, there will be question time for later on, but I have if you do not mind, we did have a lot of very important messages that were given, that were put through, but yes, one question then. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. It was very interesting. So I'm Mary Siliama from the Confederation of European Forest Owners. And when looking back, there was a very heavy debate, the political debate on this word intensity. And finally it was removed from the text. And my question to Anu maybe would be that how this is reflected then in the guidance.
Simon had an answer here already, but if you want Anu to answer, then Anu can answer.
Well, I suggest Simon to give the political answer, and then I can complement on his guidance.
I just want to say, I don't have the text in front of me, but it still is in the text, if I remember correctly.
I have it in front of me.
Not in the original place.
Right. Yeah. But I think the intensity, I think it was made by Katerina not to spend the whole day discussing intensity, but effectively it's the management intensity. And I don't think too many people in this room should misunderstand what that means. It means how much one intervenes in the forest. I'm not a forester, so I should leave the others to describe it. But it is not the focus of the FRL, it's not the focus of the guidance. And in that sense, I'll pass across. I think it was indeed a word that has been used a little bit too intensively. So.
Okay, and just to complement on that, so actually when reading it, it says that the reference level shouldn't unduly constrain the forest management intensity.
Exactly.
And this is also something that we have read really intensively, this part in the text, and basically tried to build in the description of forest management practice in the guidance, so that it would be according to this. And I know that in different countries intensity might have certain meanings, but I believe here we've tried to avoid even using the word, knowing how the debate was, but actually just really describe what we mean by forest management practice and the continuation of that for the reference level.
Just to complement, initially the contentious intensity word was a continuation of forest management practice and intensity. In that case, intensity was understood as a possibly meaning to freeze the historical harvest level, essentially. That was never in our original intention. So essentially, the fact that it has been dropped by there, from our point of view, doesn't change absolutely the principle that forest management should be based on the continuation of historical documented forest management practice. Essentially, there has been a huge misunderstanding of the intent of the word intensity. So it remained in a sentence, but was dropped in the continuation of forest management practice part, because it has essentially generated a huge misunderstanding. There has never been in the original proposal the intention to freeze historical harvest rate, as we explained clearly today.
Thank you. So one more question. Yes, please. We'll have Theo all together and okay, good.
Thank you very much for all the presentations. Rainer Adler from the Association of the Austrian Wood Industries, which is in the middle somewhere. We are now setting rules for a game. And my question is, have you already tried to give these rules to some game changers and traders, just to try what ideas could come out in worst case scenarios? Like, I mean, we import 7 million a year from our neighbor states, but it's not an import. In our case, it's very normal because it's 50 kilometers to the next summit. But how does this affect if we count in between Europe? And the question is, how does the DG Trade is involved in this game we are now setting?
Thank you. Can we have the third question as well? And then we'll have the answers.
Yeah, Ulrich Eberle from CEPI. I had just a question to Giacomo Grassi. I liked the parallel presentation of Cinderella and the forest reference level. At some point I thought if the forest, if the ball is the climate change world and Cinderella is the forest, is maybe the industry than the chimney that will not be cleaned anymore. And maybe you have an answer to that also, but more seriously, so you were mentioning that the setting of credible, transparent forest reference levels that will also increase investments, climate driven investments, and maybe you can expand on that. That would be nice. Thank you.
Thank you. So Simon to the first question, then Giacomo to the second question, and I have one question for Arno as well. Then we'll break for lunch.
But maybe Giacomo answers first. I think it would be
Okay.
Okay, because everybody remembers the last question. Right?
Well, it is of course a hope. I mean, our starting point is that, as a matter of fact, there still is a lot of mistrust in the LULUCF sector, the forest sector, because of the complexity of the sector, which is somehow unavoidable, because it's the only sector where you have emissions removal which are part of a natural carbon cycle. So it's very difficult to say is human induced, this is not human induced. The other sectors are much easier in that respect. So complexity and uncertainty is one issue. It's complex to measure the fluxes. And on the other hand, the country rules were originally aimed to focus, to identify what was the impact of additional mitigation, under Kyoto proved to be easily tweaked. And I mean, let's use this strong word, cheating was possible, at least. I'm not saying that it happened, but there was a lot of suspicion on the previous rule. And this prevented trust on the forest sector, LULUCF sector in general. That's one of the reasons why in the EU 2020 target, LULUCF was not part of that. Now, as Simon said, for the first time, LULUCF is included in the EU target. So I think that makes sense. My final statement, of course, we cannot anticipate how the future will be, but we hope that setting credibility, increased credibility in how forest accounting is done, is a prerequisite for possible greater investment. I'm not saying that it will happen, but without credibility, it's unlikely that further investment on climate-related forest mitigation will happen, in my view.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a good background also to the fact that yes, maybe Giacomo used what looked like a rather light-hearted metaphor, but it's definitely not a game. I think that climate policy is very, very serious, and we need to find a way to make sure that a very important component, land and forest, is included in EU policy as well as the international policy. So I rather regret the choice of a game. That the intention of the forest reference level is not that people should game the system. I think you're using it in that sense, perhaps. Absolutely not. Now, first of all, I can understand if you're running a business that's next to a border within Europe, and that you're sourcing mostly from across the border, that might seem very inconvenient, that it is divided by member states. But we heard also a little bit earlier how the member state concerns on forestry are very different. And while just in a region that might straddle a border, nevertheless, forestry is considered to be a very strong competence for member states. So I think we had no choice but to respect that. I think it's very good that we respected it, and that indeed there will be national implementations that will have to look at the impacts. But I don't think it's for DG Trade or the Commission to look at those impacts along the border. I think it's for the zone you're in and the neighbouring country to try to work out how to solve that. But there could indeed be an effect where across the border a member state takes a very different approach. That could be an impact on the availability of wood supply in that member state because they decide to change a policy. Now, that's something that member states will have to face up between themselves to manage. It's and I think it's not going to change, and we know that this is the basis of the policy, while member states have a competence on forest management and that will remain. It's certainly not for DG Klima, nor for trade to intervene, and we definitely steer clear from that. So we take it very seriously. We are aware of effects. We did lots of analysis, but the legislation is not aimed to constrain how a individual business or even industry will function. It's intended to have an effect on how a member state defines its policies, which could be to increase the availability, we hope, to increase the availability of biomass, because we know that there's going to be enormous need for increased biomass in the future. We're definitely not trying to place a constraint for member states on limiting the amount of biomass.
Thank you. We want all questions to be answered proper. That was a clarification to that question, I understand.
Just thank you very much. Very clear. It's not a game at all, but we have to look in detail, because if you talk about sustainability effects and figures, in my country, it's very clear that there's no clear-cut possible more than 1 hectare, 1 square kilometers. If you go to the neighbors, maybe it's completely different. It is possible there by law to do it, And I think we also have to look in this detail. So to bring all the forestries up in Europe to at least one base level. I think this we should evaluate and discuss, because yes, there will be a big effect on the trade systems.
Absolutely. Thank you for the clarification. I think the number one message from 3 presentations that we heard that came across, at least to me, was that the accounting will be done country specific, and we'll have the choice of between different sinks, different sources, different ways of coping with the goal at hand. I have a last question for Arno, and then we'll break for lunch, and we'll hear, after lunch we'll be hearing more about country-specific choices that have been prepared or pre-made already. But another question, I'll draw that, I'll keep it very simple. I'm really interested in that model of yours that you know everything about, and this one message that you all, the 3 of you, mentioned. I have a graph here where I have volume here, volume of timber that is growing in the forest, and I have the timeline here, T, and say, hypothetically, it's an exaggeration and a simplification, but nonetheless, it's year 2000 here and 2009 here. What I've done here throughout this 10-year period is I've planted trees. I planted throughout. The only thing that I've done is planting. Now I'm reaching year 2019, right, which is right around the corner. I've been growing these trees, right? The only thing that I've been doing is I've been growing them. And now the what comes next is the trees have matured, right? And I want to harvest them because they won't continue growing any longer, right? My question to you, well, 2 questions. How do I do that? Because this reference period, I only planted. I didn't harvest any at all. Is your model allowing me to harvest? And if it is allowing me to harvest, how much can I harvest if I know that there is a, tell me if I'm wrong, but if I know that there is a rule in place that Simon has put there that says emissions should not exceed removals. Was I correct?
Well, no, that's not a rule, but yeah, okay. Let that answer.
But Anna, please.
That's a really good question, but I do want to have Simon's opinion on the second part of the equation. But basically, this is exactly the idea and how we have defined it in the guidance document. That if you have defined the forest management practice and can show that from 2000 to 2009, you had a plan maybe to what to do with these planted forests. So if the plan was that I will harvest them when they are 50 years old, okay, then that would be completely according to your plan there to harvest them, which would mean that you had 0 harvest there, but you would have 100% harvest during the compliance period.
Everybody heard that?
What is really important is that it needs to be documented during that year. So you cannot now come up with new policies that, hey, I found something at Granny's attic. It needs to be actually from there, and you need to prove that that was the intention, that you haven't changed your policies since then. Because if you change your policies, then that will be accounted for and not in the reference level.
Fair. That's an excellent answer. Sam, would you comment on this bit?
The only part that I would say, from the way you presented it, it's not that there's a rule, although we do call it a no debit rule, I have to admit. There's not an obligation. Well, yeah. No, I have to be careful about how I present this. But what happens in the regulation is that there is an obligation for a member state to balance its accounts. Right. But it doesn't have to balance that account by restricting the harvest. Okay, it can balance the account by using the benefit in the other sector to substitute the debit, for example, as Giacomo and Nick also I mentioned. So if there was a debit created because of harvest, if there is a policy that has been chosen in that member state, knowing that there will be this happening in the forest sector, but we get a benefit on the building sector because of replacement of fossil materials, then that can compensate the accounts and arrive at the debit. So there is, in fact, it is true to say that in the ESR regulation there's an automated process to force that balancing, so that we always end up with a zero or better in the LULUCF account. And in fact, what happens is that the debit gets transferred to the ESR sector, because there are reasons for why that for the infringement procedures, and they're all in the ESR sector. So yes, there is a rule, but the rule is about how the accounts are balanced. The policy choice that a member state can make is to in fact deviate from that, but knowing that they will have a risk that they have to cover the debit, either from compensating from their own other part of the non-ETS, or in the, I would say, maybe extreme is too far a sentence, but in the case where there are debits and there is still an EU 28 possibility, there is the possibility to use the Article 13, that's the policy handbrake or the policy backstop. I'm using a whole lot of different terms that are used in other political discussions these days, that can be utilised to help address that. So yeah, the objective is to get the LULUCF sector indeed at that no debit, but it's not about blocking the way that we use the wood from the forest.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that answer. Javier, do you want to have another question? No.
Yeah.
Thank you. Not a question. Not another question. Not right now. I think we again owe a big round of applause for Simon, Giacomo, and we all deserve a lunch, and we'll be back here quarter to two. So it's going to be